Okay, everyone, now that we have gotten to the point in which we've talked about the Europeans coming over, the major conquering that's going to be done, let's talk about the actual changes that are going to happen. And the biggest thing is we call the Columbian Exchange, of course, named after Columbus. And this is the concept of a variety of exchanges between Europe and the Americas. And undoubtedly, the most prominent and influential is disease. Okay, into the Americas is brought smallpox, death number one, measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, influenza, typhus, chickenpox, malaria, yellow fever, the plague. It's just devastating. Malaria is kind of the undernoted one. Now, we talked a lot about malaria in Africa. It would be devastating, particularly in the southern part of the United States of America, like North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Also, much of Florida. Smallpox was the scariest. And this is what smallpox looks like. This is a little girl who had it. You get these sores and lesions all over your body. They're fluid filled. A lot of times, if you survive, they make you blind or you're scarred for life. It's absolutely awful. And I know many of you can't look at it, but you need to deal. Luckily enough, smallpox is the only disease we've ever eradicated from the planet. It no longer exists, so that's a bonus. But from 1500 to 1800, it is estimated that 100 million people, or 90% of the population of North and South America, natives, will die. You don't get any more devastating than that. And yes, sure you heard stories of the smallpox blankets and stuff like that. None of that really happened, and we don't have a lot of evidence to say that it does. But you don't need it. I would just need to have somebody that has been exposed to smallpox hang out with people who don't, and then boof, everybody's dead. Now, this is not to say that the Europeans didn't get anything. They did get syphilis, but syphilis, as we all well know, is preventable and treatable. Now, this is what we're looking at, the Columbian Exchange. To Europe, you're going to have a variety of different foods, which I'm going to be talking about in a minute, and like livestock and stuff like that, and of course, diseases. And on the way back, you're going to have a lot of money-making things. So let's look. So to Europe, they're going to get maize or corn, potatoes, beans, tomatoes, peppers, manioc, guava, avocado, pineapples, peanuts, paprika, cacao for chocolate, llama, and the alpaca. These are huge. Europe would desperately need new types of foods. The potatoes are going to probably be some of the most influential, as well as the beans. The other stuff that's a little bit harder to grow, but the potatoes and the beans are going to be absolutely huge. Now, in the Americas, it's going to result in massive changes, and that's because the Europeans believed in big clearing of fields and clearing of forests to make even more fields. And the Americas, they really didn't do that. So you're going to see a massive environmental shift in the Americas. Like, for instance, it is said that once there was a forest that went from the tip of Maine down to Florida over to Ohio. Most of that is now gone. Now, in the Americas, we get wheat, which is huge and grows just absolutely everywhere, vine crops, and most importantly, we're animals: horses, cattle, goats, sheep, pigs, and chickens. Honeybees, donkeys, onions, oranges, bananas, rice. All of this is huge, and it's going to result in a massive boom in our population. Now, the Spanish are really the ones that are mainly going to be everywhere. Mexico, Central and South America, the Caribbean, Florida. Actually, St. Augustine is the oldest European colony. And one of the main reasons they're coming here is silver. Both in the Incas and the Aztecs, they had lots of silver. The Spanish desperately wanted it. And you have the Mexicana, the Zacatecas, and the Potosi mines. We actually talked about the Potosi mines already. Silver will actually go global. And help Spain basically become the most powerful country in the world at the time. Now, the way that they would finance a lot of this as well, though, was the development of the hacienda or the encomienda. These are basically these huge estates for the development of cash crops. Now, this is going to be really important to understand. The idea of growing things not necessarily for support, but more or less to sell for profit. And the Europeans, as I'm going to talk about later, are going to use this profit to develop and drive eventually industrialization. And again, it's all about making money. Tobacco and coffee are going to be two of the biggest ones, cotton, but most importantly is sugar. The Europeans were exposed to sugar for in mass for the first time, and they desperately wanted it more and more every single day. Um, Basically, they became flat out junkies. And interesting enough, silver has been tested, or not silver, sorry, sugar has been tested to be almost as addictive as cocaine. So that can give you an idea of how much these guys really wanted their stuff. Um, it was huge. I mean, just huge. But the thing is that when you grow all these crops, you need people for them. And that's going to be a bit of a problem. You see up there a man holding a native all bloodied up by his hair. The Spanish developed something known as the mita system, that people weren't enslaved per se, but villages must send a certain number of people each year to work temporarily in the mines. Other times that you worked, you could be paid, but nonetheless, it's still brutal. And you get people working in these mines day in and day night. The encomiendas is going to be just as big, which is the Spanish were given rights to require labor from the local natives. They're supposed to provide food and shelter and stuff like that, but most of them cut corners because they just want to make money. Now, what you got, particularly in Central and South America, are these massive encomiendas, these huge fields, and then the Portuguese would set up fields and huge things in Brazil as well, called enengos. But then something interesting happened. You started to get massive conversion to Christianity. And many of the priesthood were against it because they saw all these people converting, yet were still little better than slaves. And then you also had lots of intermarriage in between these groups, okay, the natives and the Europeans, and that was starting to cause an issue. And so you had, in one of the first times in history, a crusade against slavery, led by a priest by the name of Bartolomeo de las Casas. And he felt that natives, that they were enlightened people, that they should be taken care of, that they should be helped in order to be, I guess you could say, educated and brought into the fold. And you would actually see a reduction in that, and you start a massive reduction in the slavery, and you see lots of intermarriage, and to the point where today, the most common language spoken in Latin America is Spanish, and that is because of this change in the culture. Now, we can't say it's all well and good, because you would get the destruction of ancient cities, you got, and I'll talk more about that later, but the fact of the matter is that they still had fields and they still did, needed labor. Well, you know what happens? As great as Bartolomé de las Casas was for the Americas, he was terrible for Africa, because he's the one and one of the earliest advocates of expansion of slavery in Africa, because those people weren't Christian. And then again, 12.5 million slaves taken. We've talked a lot about it in Africa. 10.7 million survived. Almost half of them went to Brazil, and then the rest to the Caribbean islands. And slavery was brutal. This is chattel slavery. These people were seen as property, okay, to be auctioned off and beaten. And it got to the point where in Brazil, the Portuguese were so brutal that for every ton of sugar they created, 3 to 5 slaves would die in the production of it. And they would produce thousands upon thousands upon thousands of tons of sugar per year. It got cheaper for them to drive a slave to kill them by the time they were 23 to 25. That's how old a slave would last in Brazil. And then they would just buy new ones. And basically, this is what you have, the system that developed. Okay, you would get the slaves coming in here to work and develop these raw goods. Those raw goods would get sent back to Europe. Particularly, you see this one focusing on England. Then they would make them into manufactured goods and sell them abroad and make all the money. And the Europeans are going to use that money for a variety of different things. And I'm going to be explaining that to you as we go on. But it's just so awful. And, we see the pictures of the slaves being stacked and everybody jammed in there. And the thing is that they had such a huge market for it, guys, that they were able to basically afford treating them so poorly and having them die, and that they just didn't care. And we talked about this in Africa, but we bring it up again, and it's just horrible, and it just pains me every time I have to talk about it. Now, what's crazy though is that then you get this system. And this is going to be really important in Africa, not Africa, I'm sorry, in Latin America today. Very big on class. So what ends up happening is you have so many different types of people, okay? At the top you had the peninsulares, okay, which were the people that were pure European and descended from the Europeans that lived there. Then after that you had the Creoles, which were the descendants of the Europeans that actually then lived there. All right. After them you had the mestizos, which were the intermarriages between the Indians and the Europeans. Then the mulattoes, in which you had relationships between slaves or sometimes free blacks. You actually had free blacks that had arrived in here or had escaped and developed their own communities. You had intermarriage with them, the Native Americans, then the African slaves. And as a result, though, with all of these groups and some of them intermarrying, sometimes runaway slaves would intermarry with natives, you have a remarkably diverse culture that we'll talk a lot about and that you'll be able to actually examine and talk about in an upcoming project. But what you can say is that the people of the Americas are still subjugated. So many of the natives die because of disease. Some do intermarry, but let's not pretend that the Europeans are still in charge. They are still pushing out the Maya language so that only everybody speaks Spanish or the French or the British. Okay, everything goes through the Europeans. Nobody else has a say in anything. And as a result, much of that culture was lost. Okay. But eventually, you're going to get the freedom movements that happen, and we'll talk about that upcoming. And the colonization here is not going to go nearly as long as we would see it in the Africas, and the devastation that we see in Africa won't necessarily see that to a degree in the Americas. All right, so make sure you get your comments and your questions, and I'll see you guys soon.